Welcome, dear viewers, to the final days of the Trojan War, a conflict that has dragged on for 10 long years. 10 years of battles, bad food, and even worse company. The Greeks were camped just outside Troy, staring at those infamous walls with a mix of frustration, desperation, and a tiny bit of envy, because really, those were some impressive walls. At this point, the Greek army was a far cry from the proud force that had first set sail for Troy. Morale was lower than the bottom of the Aegean Sea, and their supplies were dwindling faster than Achilles could throw a tantrum. The War Council, led by the illustrious and increasingly exasperated Agamemnon, was struggling to come up with a plan, any plan, that might finally breach the city walls. You see, after 10 years, ideas were running as dry as their wineskins. One suggestion was dig under the wall, because sure, why not at this point, except for the fact that the ground was solid rock. Another proposed waiting for another decade. Great idea, unless you had, a life back home. And then there was the ever popular option of hitting the walls harder, because that had worked so well for the past decade. And that's when our hero, Odysseus, finally decided he'd had enough of this nonsense. While the others debated which bad idea to try next, he was busy concocting something a bit more creative. Odysseus, known far and wide for his wit as much as his fighting skills, had an idea so crazy it just might work. He proposed building a giant horse. Yes, you heard that right, a giant horse. Big enough to hide a select group of soldiers inside. The plan was simple. Leave the horse on the beach as a peace offering to the Trojans and pretend to sail away. The Trojans, thinking the Greeks had finally given up, would haul the horse into their city as a victory trophy. But let's pause for a moment here. You might be thinking, a giant wooden horse? That's your big idea? And yes, it does sound absurd, but this was Odysseus we're talking about. He knew that sometimes the simplest tricks were the most effective. After all, if there's one thing humans, and especially Trojans, couldn't resist, it's a good old-fashioned gift. So, the Greeks got to work. Under the cover of darkness, they built this enormous hollow horse, led by Hippias, the best carpenter in the camp. This wasn't just any wooden horse, it was a masterpiece. A stunning piece of craftsmanship that was both awe-inspiring and, if you squinted hard enough, vaguely ridiculous. When the horse was finally finished, it stood taller than any structure the Greeks had ever built. It was an imposing sight. Majestic, yes, but also kind of comical. Even Odysseus had to admit it. But the key was that it looked convincing, which was all that mattered. With the horse ready, Odysseus and a hand-picked group of warriors climbed inside, squeezing together like sardines in a can. Meanwhile, the rest of the Greek army packed up their camp, burned what they couldn't carry, and set sail. Just far enough to disappear over the horizon, but close enough to return quickly when the time was right. The next morning, the Trojans woke up to find the Greek camp deserted, and this giant horse just sitting there on the beach. Imagine their surprise. They couldn't believe their luck. After years of relentless siege, the Greeks had finally given up and gone home, leaving behind this magnificent gift. The Trojans, being Trojans, did what any sensible city under siege would do. They threw open their gates and hauled the thing inside. Now, of course, there was some debate. A few of the wiser heads, like the priest Laocoon, thought maybe, just maybe, they should be a bit cautious. But when he threw his spear into the side of the horse, probably narrowly missing some poor unfortunate Greek soldier, and nothing happened, well, unless you count that weird echo, most Trojans figured it was safe. And then, just to add insult to injury, the gods sent some sea serpents to take out Laocoon and his sons. This, naturally, was taken as a sign that the horse was a divine gift, so into the city it went. As night fell, the Trojans, in their infinite wisdom, celebrated their victory with a citywide party. They danced, they sang, they drank some more. All the while, inside the wooden horse, Odysseus and his men waited patiently, and probably wondering how long it would take before the Trojans finally pass out. When the last sounds of revelry faded and the city was asleep, Odysseus and his men crept out of the horse. They carefully climbed down and opened the city gates, signaling to the Greek fleet, which had quietly returned under the cover of darkness. And just like that, the mighty city of Troy fell, not to brute force, but to the cunning mind of Odysseus, and a bit of theatrical flair. The Greeks poured into the city, and the rest, as they say, is history. Or at least a very dramatic ending to a very long war. So what's the takeaway here? Well, if you're ever in a tight spot, remember this. Sometimes the best way to win isn't by fighting harder, but by thinking smarter. And a giant horse will always help. And if that doesn't work, at least make sure your plan is memorable enough to be talked about for the next few millennia. Odysseus did it after all. Thank you for joining us in this adventure through one of the most famous and somewhat ridiculous stories of ancient warfare. Until next time, remember, never trust a gift from your enemies, especially if it's large enough to fit a small army inside.